California Edition, I'm Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from the Cannon House office building in Washington, D.C. We are joined by Ed Royce. He is a member of Congress from California. He recently became chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congratulations, sir, on your new position. How is that position going? A lot of issues before you?
Many challenges. As a matter of fact, we're just back from the Middle East,
right,
from Israel and from the region, and I can just tell you that one of the big surprises is how impactful and effective that Iron Dome has been.
For the Israelis.
It is amazing. In 2006, I was in Israel when Hezbollah was attacking Haifa. And I was in that town, and at one point we had to go into a bunker because the missiles were raining down. These rockets were hitting the civilian sectors of the town. The sirens would go off. I went down to the trauma hospital. There were 600 people in there, victims of those attacks. Yet today, with this new system of defense, it gives Israel the ability to interdict these incoming rockets.
And the Americans facilitated that deal. I mean, it was an American transaction.
We assisted it. Yes, you're right. But it was originally developed by Israelis. They had this concept that I think we were reluctant to believe could happen.
Right.
Where you'd fire and hit a bullet with a bullet, basically, and knock it down in an area that wasn't populated. So part of the whole scheme is to intercept exactly at the trajectory where you know that below that trajectory there is...
It's a miracle.
Yeah,
it is a miracle,
really,
literally.
So that's one of the issues we're looking at. I
also want to ask you about Syria.
Yes.
Which we know has been in a civil war for a few years now. Right. And recently it appears that the Israelis went into Syria through the air and struck some targets, likely Hezbollah terrorist factories, I guess we could call it. What's your sense of that situation?
Well, I'll tell you what that was about.
Please.
They don't acknowledge, these operations. True. But what Israel has said is that they don't want these new rockets with a longer range and with the ability to carry a payload such as chemical weapons, they don't want those to fall into the hands of Hezbollah. And inasmuch as Syria has transferred and Iran are the two countries that transfer rockets, when they find that rockets are going to be transferred to Hezbollah,
in Lebanon,
these larger rockets with a greater range and the more lethal rockets, then they take action.
You mentioned chemical weapons, and as we speak today, we don't know for sure, but it appears that Syria may have used chemical weapons on its own people. And President Obama had indicated in the past on a few occasions that if that happened, it will be time for America to intervene in some fashion. What can you tell us about that statement and where America goes from here?
Well, first, the president has moved away from that statement since the evidence has come out.
You think he has backtracked a bit?
He has. But what is happening in the region, which is of considerable importance, is that the Europeans, along with the Saudis and Jordanians, are working to try to give support to the Free Syrian Army. The Free Syrian Army is a coalition of forces that are Shiite, Sunni, Alawite, Kurdish. Unfortunately, at the same time, Qatar, the country of Qatar, is supplying foreign fighters coming from outside of Syria and joining groups like al-Nusra.
Sure.
So the international community there in the Middle East are trying to put pressure on Qatar to cease and desist
and let's continue that conversation when we come back. For our viewers on HLN, thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. There's no doubt, sir, that the Free Syrian movement, their motives may be good, but there could be bad guys in that movement as well. And so when Qatar assists, if the Americans assist, we don't know if there really are friends in the final analysis.
What the French are doing on the ground is vetting the officers that come into the Free Syrian forces. The Jordanians are involved in this too, because it's in their interest, it's in the interest of the Europeans that are involved there, to keep the al-Nusra, or shall we call them they call them the bearded fighters, the fighters who don't come from Syria, but come from, let's say, Qatar or Yemen or these other countries that have been radicalized, right? And then try to join the fight. That's where the struggle is occurring, and trying to keep these foreign fighters out, because I think the perception is that Assad is going to fall.
Right.
The hope is that he's replaced by a coalition government rather than, foreign fighters, because if those foreign fighters were to, storm Damascus and get control of the government, that would be a headache for Europe, for the Middle East, frankly, for all the players.
In a lot of ways, it's the devil you know. And look, Mr. Mubarak in Egypt may have been brutal to his people, but where are we today? We have the Muslim Brotherhood leading the Egyptian government, and one could argue that that government is not a friend to America, to Israel. So,
well, I think a blunder was made in Egypt, and that blunder was not using the considerable influence that our military had with the Egyptian military to hold off the elections for a year and transition. Now, this is the way in which Indonesia confronted its difficulties. We got engaged there, made sure there were fair and free elections. As you know, there is real question as to the election irregularities that existed in that election in Egypt, because the opposition feel that the election was stolen. It was that close, and had there been more time to build up a credible opposition, because the only really organized force on the ground at the time was the Muslim Brotherhood. So this was a mistake. This was a mistake because there was the very real possibility that we could get a government in Egypt under a fair election that was much more welcoming to the other minority rights of the community, like the Coptic Christians. The Christian community, of course, face a very dire future under the Muslim Brotherhood.
And it's 10% of the country. It's not an infinitesimal minority.
And you also have the business community, the moderate
secular
Muslim business community in Cairo and in Alexandria that really want no part of the radical governance of. And so those were the coalitions that were trying to hold a fair election, and they feel the election was stolen.
I want to shift gears and speak about North Korea.
Sure.
We now have the son of the prior leader in charge. Yeah. He seems to be trying to pound his chest in ways that are baffling. He invites Dennis Rodman into his
unique.
His borders. Yeah. He loves the NBA, but yet he's crazy talk.
Here's the unfortunate part, and I've been in North Korea. I think the saddest thing about North Korea are the camps, the work camps, in which if you're perceived as offending the regime, not only do you go to the camp, your whole family goes to the camp. So you're in a situation where young people are born, children are born into this, and because of the perceived sins of the father or the mother, the whole family is now doomed to be worked to death in the camps. I've talked to some of those who escaped from those situations, defectors who make their way, over the border into China and then eventually into South Korea. And I've talked to these defectors about just how life is like for these 250,000, 300,000 Koreans that live, North Koreans that live in these work camps. It is so inhumane. And the other observation I would make is that the focus of the government there to have 3-stage ICBMs with this nuclear capability, that's concerning, of course, to all of the neighborhood. So now you notice South Korea is starting to panic, Japan, Taiwan, all are talking about trying to get a nuclear weapon. This is not what we want to see as an arms race.
Sure.
So the international community is moving on sanctions on North Korea, and this is as it must be.
And we'll see
because
what happens.
the regime uses hard currencies.
Okay, his name is Ed Royce, member of the US Congress, chairman of House Foreign Affairs. I'm Brad Pomerance. This is California Edition.
How many nations have declared their allegiance to communism? 5 nations currently operate pursuant to communist philosophy: China, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam.
California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from the Cannon House office building in Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Tom McClintock. I'm sure you know him. He is a member of the United States Congress representing significant portions of Northern California. You've been here since 2008, spent 22 years in the state legislature in Sacramento. Give us a sense about the differences, the distinctions, the similarities.
Well, yeah, the process is completely different. I thought it'd be a pretty simple transition, and I realized I was at a great disadvantage because I first had to unlearn what I'd learned during 22 years in the state legislature.
Meaning what?
Well, you're dealing with a body of 435 members, and it's a body that has based all of its parliamentary practices not on the parliamentary manuals of the 19th century, as our state legislatures have, which are very structured, logical progressions of action. Instead, it's structured on Jefferson's manual, which uncharacteristically of him is simply an unorganized hodgepodge of observations of precedents from the early Congresses and from the Parliament. His was really the first parliamentary authority ever written down. So, and all the rules of the House are built up on that foundation rather than the foundations we typically think of when we talk about parliamentary process. And the size of the place, 435 members, is a much different deliberative dynamic than the 40 members of the state Senate, for example.
And what's interesting is Californians know you well as a strong conservative, especially on economic matters. And yet the term conservative has morphed over the last few years.
Well, it has, and I think a lot of that occurred during the Bush administration, which did some very, very unconservative things under the conservative banner, and now that definition is changing before our eyes. So those of us who become extremely concerned about blurring what once was a clear distinction between civilian and military authority, a very clear distinction between war and peace, are now considered, I guess,
liberals,
on these issues. But I've not changed my position. The position I have always taken is a strictly constitutional one.
So how does that feel for you then? That because your positions are the same, yet the perception of conservatism or the effectuation of conservatism has differed.
Interestingly, this is not the first time in our history this has happened. In fact, Abraham Lincoln once mused about the old Whig and Democratic parties literally changing their positions on the free soil issue 180 degrees in the span of a decade. He said it was like watching two drunken men fight their way into one another's overcoats. So this has happened before. It certainly will happen again.
Even with Democrats and Republicans, you think about early in the 20th century, the Democratic base was rock solid in the South. The Republican base was rock solid in the Northeast. We've seen the flip.
Very famous political scientist by the name of E.O. Key that basically theorized that about every 40 years or so this happens. So there's a very stable political coalition over 40 years over a very specific set agenda. And at the end of about a 40-year period, that agenda is no longer relevant to the issues at hand. It loses its grip over those coalitions. Those coalitions break apart. You have a period of enormous political instability. And if he stopped theorizing in the 1950s, but if you count his 40-year cycle, we're right back there again.
And let's talk about that, because there's no doubt that the Republican coalition is changing a bit. It really was, especially in California.
And by the way, the Democratic coalition changing as well.
No doubt. In California, it was really kind of an economic coalition, but now those forces are fraying on issues like immigration. Where does the Republican Party go from here?
Well, the central organizing philosophy of the Republican Party since its inception can be summarized in a single word: freedom. It's basically constitutionally limited government, individual liberty, and personal responsibility. The closer the party over the years has hewn to those principles, the better it's done. The farther it's drifted from those principles, the worse it's done.
Let's continue the conversation. For our viewers on HLN, thank you for joining us. We'll be right back. So there is no doubt the Republican Party's principles, like you said, have at some level fixated on the notion of freedom, but the definition of freedom, depends on who you speak with.
Well, I mean, I don't share that perspective. I think freedom is very, very clear and has been well defined, starting with the American Declaration of Independence. These are unchanging principles. The problem is the party's dedication to those principles has ebbed and flowed over the years. In my view, great parties are built upon great principles, and they are judged by their devotion to those principles. That was the tragedy of the Bush years.
And I want to speak with you about one principle, one economic principle, and that principle is the notion that America's full faith and credit should never be questioned. And you have expressed serious concern that the full faith and credit of America is called into question when, for example, issues like the debt ceiling have been politicized. Ironic that, Mr. McClintock, a diehard conservative, a true Republican, is coming out against many members of his own party.
Well, I don't believe that's the case at all. In fact, it's the Democrats who seem to be opposed to our legislation that would simply place the full faith and credit of the United States beyond any question, which, by the way, is what the 14th Amendment to our Constitution calls for. The public credit is the foundation upon which our entire government operates, particularly when it's now borrowing 40 cents of every dollar that it spends.
And I hear you, but what about that debt ceiling, that political football that we've seen be used over the last few years? Has that caused you concern?
What concerns me is that as we approach the debt limit, given the great fiscal controversies that are now dividing our country and also now dividing our Congress, we're going to have a period of protracted disputes over fiscal policy. Those disputes, however, should never be allowed to imperil the full faith and credit of the United States government. That's why we have this act, H.R. 807, which simply mandates that the Treasury Secretary pay the principal and interest on the debt, and even if it requires a temporary exemption from the debt limit. That way, credit markets can look at the United States and say, whatever's going on in Washington, the loans that we have made to this government are secure. A default is not a possibility.
Right. So what are your friends on the Democratic side saying about this bill that you propose?
The argument that we hear constantly is that this would be a prelude to, this is an excuse for not paying our other bills. And the point I've been making is, wait a second, most of our states have similar provisions in their constitutions or in their statutes. California obviously has one, and it's had one for well over 100 years. Not one of those states in those hundreds of years that these provisions have been in operation have ever used that as an excuse not to pay their other bills. And again, I want to make it very clear. This is not a prelude to a protracted debt crisis that causes us not to pay our other bills. Well, my point is this. That would be a very bad thing. There's only one thing that I can think of fiscally that would be worse, and that is a credit default of the United States. That's what this measure simply takes off the table, the way other states have done for years. Ben Bernanke made the point in the Senate and also before our House Budget Committee that the state provisions have protected their credit. That's why, despite all of the difficulties in some of those markets, credit is still easily extended to them because they can see that there's a constitutional guarantee they'll be paid.
So where does the sequester come into this? Because in a lot of ways, it appears the markets may prefer that the sequester kicked in. I mean, we haven't seen a lot of hits to the markets.
Actually, Standard & Poor's warned us at the time that we needed to make debt reductions some 3 times larger than that called for in the sequester to maintain our AAA credit rating. That's one of the reasons I voted against the Budget Control Act that established the sequester, was it was wholly inadequate to meet our the need for our AAA credit rating. So, it's rather modest in the grand scheme of things.
But are your constituents expressing concern about the sequester, the way the cuts seem to be not targeted, but just across the board?
On the contrary, I think it has provoked a very, very healthy discussion. It started with the president's decision to close the White House to visitors to save $18,000 a week. $18,000 is what it costs to operate Air Force One every 6 minutes. So that then invited a big discussion. If you were president, would you save $18,000 by closing the White House or by operating Air Force One by an average of 6 minutes less a week? Then we had the air traffic control issue, and again, we're seeing memos from the administration to the agency saying, make these cuts hurt. When the FAA took a 4% reduction of their budget and made it a 40% delay in flights, that provoked another question.
He's Tom McClintock. I'm Brad Pomerance. This is California Edition.
What state's residents maintain the largest number of self-identified conservatives? In a Gallup poll released in February 2013, more Alabama residents identified themselves as conservatives than any other state in the union, 50.6%.
Welcome, my name is Brad Pomerance. Glad you're with us today. We are joined by Greg Walden. He's a member of the United States Congress representing the state of Oregon. He currently serves as the chair of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, and recently out of that committee was a bill that really is quintessentially American, dealing with our freedoms. Talk to us about that.
Well, Brad, thank you, and thanks for letting me join you today. So the Internet Freedom Bill really is about preventing an arm of the United Nations from putting in place legacy regulations to oversee the internet. These regulations date back to the days of telephones. I mean, like copper wire connections, not internet and information flow.
Not fiber.
No, and they're really problematic because some of the countries that are leading the effort to regulate the internet do not have the same sort of value set that we have when it comes to democracy, freedom of speech, all of those sorts
Right,
of
and I'm sure you heard that recently Google has left China, mainland China, because they're completely deterred by their constant censorship. So a bill like this clearly is addressing those types of issues.
It is, and it's designed to prevent this international body from passing a treaty, in effect, that would empower some of these governments to have a lot more ability to pry into our privacy, to control the flow of information on the internet. You think about the Arab uprising, the spring, all of that, the communication ability among people seeking freedom was really one of the core elements as a success of that revolution, if you will. Now, part of that was the ability to just communicate back and forth, whether it was on, Facebook or texting or phone calls, whatever. And what we want to avoid is a government, a regime, especially a repressive regime, from putting standards in place that snuff out democracy, snuff out freedom of speech. And as Americans, we've always highly valued our First Amendment rights.
Right, so essentially what we're saying is we will not join this treaty.
It's not our policy, correct.
And so where does the bill stand? It was a bipartisan effort that got it out of your committee.
Yeah.
We'll go to the floor.
Right. So we passed it out of the subcommittee, we passed it out of the full Committee on Energy and Commerce, and it will now go to the floor of the House of Representatives, where I anticipate it probably will get near unanimous support, which in this world, in this city, is a little rare.
Remarkable.
We worked out some language issues the Democrats had initially with it, and came to a very strong piece of legislation.
What about our friends in the United States Senate?
I think the way we've crafted this, they should be able to pick it up and pass it as well as a statement of U.S. policy, which is a level higher than the resolution we passed last year.
And speaking of bipartisanship, you have worked with two members from your home state, Mr. DeFazio, Mr. Schrader, on trying to protect the beautiful forests that really typify the beautiful state of Oregon.
Well, yeah, I mean, about half of my district is controlled by the federal government.
Right.
A lot of that is federal forest land. I think we have, 10 or 11 national forests in the district. And the problem is they're not well managed right now. They suffer from bug infestation, they get hit by drought. There's not much management going on. Think of it as a backyard or your garden that you never tend to. You just let it, and so.
It's so disappointing to think.
So then when you get a fire, which we get every summer, it burns hotter than it should, it destroys more than it should, it clogs our valleys with smoke, and then we don't go back in as a federal government and kind of do repair.
So as part of that bipartisan effort, are we looking towards the repairs that you see?
It's more active forest management, which will do two other things. It will not only make the forest healthier, it will create jobs in our rural forested communities. We still have some of the highest unemployment rates in the country, in the state of Oregon and in the rural parts of Oregon, where you got counties 60-70%.
When we come back, I want to speak with you about healthcare reform if we can. We're speaking with Greg Walden. For our viewers on HLN, we thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. So, Congressman, I know that you have spent a lot of time in your district. I think you've had 21 town hall meetings.
So far this year.
Right. And if I was speaking to you 2 years ago, my gut tells me there would have been a lot of discussion about health care.
Right.
Today, What are your constituents saying? Is healthcare reform on top of mind?
It is, Brad, and it's morphed from a discussion sort of philosophical based or party based. You're for or against it because you're Republican, a Democrat, a conservative, a liberal, whatever. Now we're into the very specific impacts. Higher premiums are starting to be rolled out, and people are getting sticker shock.
And you mentioned higher premiums. I wanted to talk to you about that because there is no doubt that businesses are a bit nervous.
That's an understatement.
Right, and so what some businesses are doing is if they can, they'll try to limit part-time hours as a way to avoid having...
People are losing their jobs, they're getting cut back. But all these were predicted consequences of this law.
The question, though, is I believe Oregon is opening its own exchange as we know it. I believe Oregon's accepting the Medicaid expansion. So will those two programs help those that because of business nervousness, will it get them that coverage?
Well, it's a lot more than business nervousness. It's a huge cost hit, especially to small businesses that will now be forced by law to either provide this coverage to anybody working more than 30 hours. And so people are literally losing their jobs right now. They're being scaled back to 28 or 29 hours to fall under that. So now they're going to end up working 2 part-time jobs and not have benefits.
But what about the health care issue?
So then they go into Medicaid.
Or the exchange?
Well, maybe, but most likely they'll end up in Medicaid. And then your problem's going to be accessing health care because there are a lot of providers that, because of Medicaid's low reimbursement rates, say, I can't afford to take Medicaid.
But in the final analysis, and again, we don't know because we haven't seen the full implementation of the Affordable Care Act. I mean, is there a sense that the law is here, whether we like it or not, it's here. We've got to somehow make it work.
Well, certainly there are people that believe that, and others believe that it is so flawed fundamentally, it will either bankrupt the country or simply not work. And the promises that the president and others made that said you get to keep the health insurance plan you have, that premiums would go down $2,100 or thereabouts, they've actually gone up $2,000 to $4,000 depending upon which category you're in. And so we haven't seen the cost reductions.
And what's interesting is in terms of those spikes, what we've seen is some of those spikes are being felt more by the younger folks.
Oh, yes.
The older folks, not so much the Medicaid crowd, they seem to maybe getting relief. Look, it's
no,
hard
I
to
don't
know.
agree because Medicare got cut by over $716 billion from Medicare Advantage. So a rural district like the one I represent, you're seeing a downward pressure on reimbursement rates, which means physicians are going to have a tougher and tougher time seeing seniors.
What about rural areas? Because that really has become quite the challenge. I know in some states telehealth is becoming an option. I have
Oregon
to think,
certainly is.
Yeah,
in that
so talk
category.
to us about.
So a couple of things. One is broadband expansion, which I've supported both wireless and
we're glad
hardwire.
to help in that, that area.
That's right. And so there's a lot more we can do on telehealth, telemedicine. And making sure that America leads on innovation and technology in this sector.
Sure.
Now, in the healthcare law, there's a 2.3% gross receipts tax on medical devices. We had a hearing recently to determine what's a medical device.
Interesting.
Is it an app on your phone?
Right.
Is it your iPad? Now, they say no to the iPad and the iPhone. Okay, fine. But then what app is there? And there's a lot of new technology emerging. I'm afraid we're going to snuff it out in the United States and shift it offshore.
And it's interesting that you happen to also be, as we said, the chair of
the
Technology Committee. In our final moments, I want to speak with you about another job of yours. You are the chair of the National Republican Campaign Committee. It depends who you talk to. Some think the Republicans are going to have a great 2014. Others aren't so sure. Give us your sense of how 2014 looks for the Republican caucus in the House.
You know, I'd rather be us than them is kind of my...
That's a fair way to
I wouldn't
say
have said that in 06 or 08. But look, people want us to come here and solve problems and to work things out, but do it in a way that's going to grow jobs, actually reduce the cost of health care, not increase it. I just see, back-to-back trillion-dollar deficits. The Democrats haven't put forward a budget that balances yet, even though it raises $1 trillion in taxes. And I just think Americans go, that's not the future I want for my kids and grandkids, and it's not going to create jobs.
What about in Oregon? A bluer state, fair enough.
It is.
So how does it look in Oregon specifically? You think the race could pick up some seats?
There are about 50 competitive seats around the country is what I think both sides would agree it comes down to. And there may be 1 or 2 in Oregon as well.
Not bad.
They're probably not in the top tier,
You'll make it that
certainly,
way.
But well, you
You'll
got
make
to
it that
have the
way.
right candidate with the
I
right
hear you.
ideas and vision. And
Greg
build
Walden, I
the
want to
right
thank you so much
campaign.
for
You bet,
joining
Brad.
us. His
Good
name
to
is
be
Greg
with you.
Walden, member of the United States Congress. My name is Brad Pomerance. Thank you so much for joining us.